All right, so these are the Falkland Islands, as Britain and the English-speaking countries call them, or Islas Malvinas, as Argentina and the Spanish-speaking countries call them. Whatever their name is, we can agree that they are a remote, windswept, and almost treeless place in the South Atlantic Ocean, about 300 miles or 480 kilometers off the coast of Argentina. So today, the Falkland Islands are home to almost 4,000 permanent inhabitants that are nicknamed Kelpers, plus about 1,500 military personnel. Also home to about 500,000 sheep. One time I gave a talk on what you can see and do at Port Stanley, and after the talk, there was a group of people that came up to me to ask me a couple questions, and one of those guests, she comes up to me and she says, "Excuse me, you didn't put any pictures of sheep." And I say, no, I didn't put any pictures of sheep. And she says, "Why not?" I say, "Are you interested in seeing sheep?" She says, "No, but there's a lot." I say, "Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. They do products with wool. They eat sometimes." And she says, "Yeah, so why don't you put any?" And there were a group of people there, so she was asking for validation from other guests, and she looked at one of the guests, and the guest was like... And then the guest said, "Yeah, there's also a lot of dogs, but he didn't put any pictures of dogs either." and then when I gave the talk on the war, a guest came up to me and said, "Hey, you didn't mention how many sheep died during the war." All right, so home to about 500,000 sheep and around 1 million penguins. Nowadays, these islands don't get much attention anymore, maybe an article every once in a while, or when cruise ships or expedition ships like us visit for a few months of the year. But for 10 weeks in 1982, these tiny islands were the center of attention when they became the setting for a brutal war between Great Britain and Argentina. In the Falklands, the memory of the war still looms, and for many, the long-standing dispute between Argentina and Britain remains a sensitive matter. The United Nations have recognized the islands as a territory in dispute and have expressed the need for both nations to resume talks over the dispute. The British and the Kelpers certainly want to be and think that they're British, while many Argentinians are convinced that the islands should be part of Argentina, while many others simply don't care. Nowadays, most countries, even longtime British ally United States, have decided to abstain from partaking in opinion on this matter, only encouraging talks between both disputing nations. So after the war, the islands became way more popular, both in the media and touristically. But in the 1980s, before any Google or any other search engine existed, they were not very popular. In fact, I would say that today, many members of the young generations, especially from the UK, are not very familiar with these islands. I've asked many people that are around my age, and they say that, yeah, maybe they've heard about it at school, maybe something was mentioned, but they don't really know the history in depth, and they don't really know exactly what happened. They just know a war happened a long time ago, but they're not really sure what the situation was or is. Now, in Argentina, it's a little bit different. I went to school, obviously, in Argentina, and the message that we got over and over again was basically Britain stole the islands from Argentina. Not my personal opinion, just saying whatever we were taught. And that's a message that we hear over and over again in Argentina without really going very deeply into what happened, what does that phrase mean, who was there first, what actually happened. We just hear this phrase over and over again, the Malvinas were stolen by Britain, without really understanding what that means. And I went to a private school, which, in Argentina is a little bit better than public education in general. And as you can imagine, the message in public schools is even greater in that sense, even more of Britain stole the islands. So today's talk is not about who is right or who is wrong. It's also not about taking a look at the historical facts. This talk is mostly about what happened just before the war, during the war, and what happened after that. As you can imagine, in 45 minutes, I will not be able to cover 400 years of history, so I'm going to devote myself mostly to just what happened just before the war, during the war, and after the war. So I'm going to do a couple of disclaimers. First of all, I want to say that I have no emotional attachment to this cause. That doesn't mean that I don't recognize or empathize the suffering that might have happened from this war and that maybe still happens today. But the fact that I don't have any emotional attachment doesn't mean that I don't empathize with the situation, in the same sense that maybe some of you don't have emotional attachment to perhaps if Hong Kong is part of China or not, but that doesn't mean that you don't empathize if people die there or somebody is injured or anything of the sorts. Also, I'll be talking a little bit more about the Argentinian point of view. And when I say point of view, I don't mean side point of view as in the literal sense of the word. Point of view, from where you view things. Why? Well, because I'm from Argentina, I went to school in Argentina, I lived almost my whole life in Argentina, and guess what? I'm going to be able to give you more from the Argentinian point of view, which again doesn't mean Argentinian side. Also, I've given this talk many, many times. I would say the thing is the 16th time that I've given a talk about the Falkland Islands. And average, let's say about 600 people see these talks. 600 times 15, it's a little bit over 10,000 people. Out of 10,000 people that have seen the talk, only 2 people have expressed discontent with the talk. So that's 2 out of 10,000. I would say that's a pretty good average, right? So I am not looking to increase that number to 3 today, just so you know, all right? So sorry for the long disclaimer, but I think it's good to be honest from the start, right? Now, of course, this is a very special topic, not only for me, but I think for you as well. Probably one of the highlights or the highlight for this cruise for you is coming here to the Falklands, once-in-a-lifetime experience for the vast majority of you. And that is why for this talk, I have interviewed 2 people that are going to walk us through what happened and give us the possibility to hear from the people that were actually there. So one of them is Elisa Heathman. She's a local islander who has been living here her whole life, and she was obviously there during the 1982 war. And also Marcelo Lapajufcar, who is an Argentinian who fought during the Malvinas War. So, what was life like in the islands before 1982?
Life before 1982 was very simple, very peaceful. Life was much easier in those days, I think. People weren't so busy, but we probably were stagnating economically, to be quite honest, but we were muddling along.
Okay, so let me explain what she's talking about. Actually, let's hear first, what was the relationship like between the islands and Great Britain? Let's see.
Oh, very good, always. Well, I say always. There was a period in the late 60s where we sort of were struggling, and throughout the 70s, I can remember as a teenager sort of constantly being a bit afraid that we might be traded away at some stage.
Okay, so let me explain what that means. So by the 1960s, the islands are populated mostly by the islanders, and mostly they were of British descent. There were some Chileans there and a few Argentinians as well. And in 1967, the British government says that they are willing to transfer the islands to Argentina if the desires from the locals is respected. Now, Argentina was not willing to negotiate under these terms since they saw the current population as a product of illegitimate colonization in the first place. But still, they say, okay, let's sit down at the same table, let's start negotiating. And so after some diplomatic talks between Great Britain and Argentina, which actually was the first time that these 2 countries were sitting at a negotiating table since 1833, Argentina and Britain released a joint statement saying basically that they are willing to transfer the islands to Argentina if they are going to be ready to fulfill certain promises, and that if they fulfill those promises, those projects, then that could pave the way for a transfer to Argentina. Because of this, Argentina begins to expand their influence on the islands by adding infrastructure, economical, and political aid. And there's many Argentine companies, Argentine national companies, that begin to come to the Falkland Islands. Also, a small airstrip is constructed, and the national airline that was called LADE at the time, the national airline from Argentina, starts flying to the Falkland Islands as well. So this is an ad actually from LADE, the national airline at the time. And as you may notice, it has Port Stanley on the bottom right as one, or on the left on the bottom right, as one of its destinations. And by the way, I might add that the name of Port Stanley is in English. This is an advertisement from Argentina, but the name is in English, Port Stanley. And this is an advertisement that was released in January 1972, so 10 years before the war. Another example is from YPF, the national oil company, which also they set up shop in the Falkland Islands, and even an advertisement by Dodge, because this was the first Argentinian car that made it to the Falkland Islands. So that's why they have the LADE airplane in the background, and then this Dodge car that was produced in Argentina and brought to the Falkland Islands. Now, I mentioned that when I went to school, which was obviously after the war, we talked a lot about the Malvinas. The topic was brought up often. But what about for Marcelo, who went to school before the war?
En la Argentina se hablaba de Malvinas en la época que yo iba a la escuela primaria, muy poco. Y cuando hablabas de Malvinas era como algo, una cosita muy sui generis, donde dibujabas un poco las islas o ponías con algodón las nubes o la nieve. Era como, no se hablaba mucho de eso, era como un tema bastante desconocido en la escuela, pero, por ejemplo, la Marcha de Malvinas, que es una canción del año 46 o 48, difícilmente se escuchaba como se escuchó a partir de la guerra, ¿no? Fue el himno prácticamente de la guerra.
Okay, so the UK controls the islands, and Argentina, who had been claiming the islands for a long time, basically since 1833, is beginning to expand its influence on the islands by the end of the 1960s. In fact, a few decades before, the president at the time, Juan Domingo Perón, had offered to buy the islands from Britain, but this proposal was rejected. And I talked about 1833 a couple times because 1833 was basically the year that, for the British and for the Kelpers, that's the year that Britain recovered sovereignty over the islands. And 1833, for the Argentinians that think that the islands should be part of Argentina, that year, 1833, is the year that, according to them, Britain stole the islands from Argentina. Again, not my personal opinion, just saying what they say. But now we get to 1976. So do you know what happened in 1976 in Argentina? Anybody? Correct. Military dictatorship. A military dictatorship takes place in Argentina, and they covertly establish a military base in the South Sandwich Islands. The British protest by sending a task force, which is fired by one of the Argentine destroyers. And as we approach 1982, we have to keep the following in mind. So there was a military dictatorship that was in place, was in power, and the social and economic situation was tremendous, lots of social and economic turmoil. Inflation was up to 600% per year. GDP had fallen greatly and unemployment was on the rise. To give you an idea of the inflation, my parents would tell me that they would go to the supermarket, they would pick up a product, and while they were in line to pay for the product, there would be an announcement saying that the prices had already changed. That's how much of inflation there was. But most of all, thousands and thousands of people had gone missing as part of the state terrorism that the government was employing. The people's trust in the government was decaying, and the military junta needed something to bring the people together, and unfortunately, they went with a war. It wasn't the first time that they had tried to do this. In fact, a few years before, in 1978, Argentina hosted the World Cup, which they won in 1978 in Argentina, and a lot of people say that that cup was rigged in order to hide the atrocities that were happening in the country. Then in 1981, Argentina and Chile almost went to war over the Beagle Channel, a conflict that was averted by the Pope at the time, John Paul II, and this time in 1982, unfortunately, nobody stopped the war.
The first we heard of an Argentine invasion was we knew something was going on previously during the afternoon, because we knew the governor had called all the heads of departments to his office in the afternoon, so we were aware that something was happening. And we had been listening, of course, to the BBC, so we knew what was happening in South Georgia. And then about 7:30 in the evening, the governor announced to the population that the invasion was imminent. And he had only had that transmission from London in the middle of the afternoon himself, saying it was imminent, they would be here by dawn.
So indeed, on April 1st, 1982, one day before the war started, the governor of the Falkland Islands, Rex Hunt, receives a telegram from the British Foreign Office stating, "We have apparently reliable evidence that an Argentine task force will gather off Cape Pembroke early tomorrow morning, April 2nd. You will wish to make your dispositions accordingly." Well, given that all he had was 68 Marines, 11 sailors, and 25 civilian defense force members, his dispositions were somewhat limited. So it didn't take long for the Argentine army to take control of the islands, as their numbers greatly surpassed the islanders, and the Argentine flag is raised over Government House. United Nations passes Resolution 502, which demanded Argentina to cease fire and remove all of its troops, and also encouraged both governments to find a diplomatic solution to the problem.
Galtieri sale, o sea, el presidente argentino de facto, sale a ese balcón de la Casa Rosada y anuncia que Argentina había recuperado las islas. Y el mismo pueblo o la misma gente, incluso más, porque desbordaba de gente Plaza de Mayo, fueron a vitorear a ese gobierno que había recuperado las islas mediante la fuerza, sin tener en cuenta en la cabeza qué era lo que podía pasar. Nadie sabía lo que era una guerra.
So word soon reached Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, that British territory had been invaded by a foreign power, and she wasted no time in condemning the invasion. But things were not going so well for Thatcher back in the UK, as she was also battling a political and economical crisis. But the Falklands incident turned out to be a turning point of her career. Acting quickly, she converted what could have been a source of national shame into one of shared purpose, and although there was no prior contingency plan for invasion of the Falklands, she worked closely with their military leaders and assembled a task force that set sail to the South Atlantic Ocean only 3 days after the invasion, using whatever ships were available. The House of Commons met on Saturday, April 3rd, one day after the invasion, where Margaret Thatcher announced that an invasion had taken place.
Mr. Speaker, sir, the House meets this Saturday to respond to a situation of great gravity. We are here because for the first time for many years, British sovereign territory has been invaded by a foreign power. After several days of rising tension in our relations with Argentina, that country's armed forces attacked the Falkland Islands yesterday and established military control of the islands. Mr. Speaker, yesterday was a day of rumour and counter-rumour. Throughout the day, we had no communication from the government of the Falklands. Indeed, the last message we received was at 21:55 hours on Thursday night, the 1st of April. By late afternoon yesterday, it became clear that an Argentine invasion had taken place and that the lawful British government of the islands had been usurped. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that the whole House will join me in condemning totally this unprovoked aggression by the government of Argentina against British territory.
Even the ocean liner, Queen Elizabeth II, was requisitioned as a troop transport carrying over 3,000 troops. The entire British task force was comprised of 127 ships. The first of these set sail to the South Atlantic on April 5th, just 3 days after the invasion.
El 3 de abril, si no me equivoco, dijeron, bueno, los 18 soldados que vamos a nombrar van a dar un paso al frente y van a participar de la guerra de Malvinas. Y como tengo esta diferencia con mucha gente, me dicen, pero vos querías que te llamen, que digan tu nombre, que te elijan. La verdad que sí, porque yo ahí entré en un loop muy raro de ignorancia y patriotismo, porque lo que quiere un soldado recién entrado es decir que te elijan para ir a una guerra, defender tu país, los valores de tu país, la bandera, a la gente que vive acá, y no pensás que tenés 18 años, que recién entraste, que no sabes nada, que no estás preparado, pero vos crees que sí. Entonces, a mí me invadió ese sentimiento, esa emoción, Y cuando di ese paso al frente, esos 90 centímetros, 1 metro, ahí me cambió la vida para siempre.
So the 2 to 3 week voyage gave British forces additional time to prepare for combat. So by the time the first Royal Marines landed, they were battle ready. But so too were the Argentines, who had been making their own preparations by laying some 25,000 to 30,000 landmines across the beaches and rolling hills of the islands.
Really, we didn't have much communication anywhere within the islands after the initial few weeks. So information was quite scant, apart from what we were getting from the BBC.
So British landings begin and casualties start to mount on both sides. There were several bloody battles between both parties, resulting in hundreds of casualties, wounded, destructions of ships, planes, and general panic. The largest casualty event for Argentina was the sinking of the Ara General Belgrano on May 2nd, resulting in 368 deaths. This was also a defining moment in the war, as many people realized the gravity of the situation and many families realized that their children were not coming back home.
Éramos 2 Marcelos, un Ricardo y un Sergio. Y teníamos que ahí cavar nuestro pozo para vivir ahí, porque no es una trinchera, es un pozo en la tierra que está congelada porque está bajo cero, porque la turba es porosa, porque el agua pasa por la napa, las piedras te molestan. Empezás a cavar con esa pala retráctil que yo decía tenía en mi equipo, y la pala arranca un poco de tierra al principio, pero cuando llega la piedra no la puede correr y la pala queda inútil, y empezamos con los cascos a sacar tierra y piedra hasta que eso no funcionó y terminamos haciéndolo con las manos de noche. No hay mucha luz, en la guerra no hay mucha luz, el clima hostil, la lluvia, el aguanieve, la nieve, el viento es impresionante. Lo mejor que nos podía pasar era estar los 4 en ese mismo pozo, porque nos acomodábamos muy pegados para darnos calor con el que tenemos al lado, ¿no?
Some British newspapers were decidedly anti-war, while The Sun, for example, became controversial for headlines just as this one. The largest casualty event for Britain was the sinking of the HMS Sheffield that was hit by a missile on May 4th, killing 20, and this was the first time that a Royal Navy vessel was sunk in action since World War II. And then in June, destruction of Sir Galahad takes place. Although it wasn't easy, the superiority of the British Army becomes evident, slowly regaining territory, and the defeat of the Argentines was imminent. But the news back home was very, very different. The media was coerced and lied to by the military government, and they misled the Argentine people into believing that the war was being won by Argentina. But this was, of course, fake propaganda by the military dictatorship. And according to Elisa, the islanders knew that the government from Argentina was lying to the Argentine population. On occasions, there were letters that were sent to the soldiers or from the soldiers back home that were not delivered, and most of these letters were read by the government or by their officials, the officers of the army. And if the content was not to their liking, then the letter might have not only not been delivered, but also the soldier or their families might have been targeted. Marcelo told us that during his time in the Falklands, he received 187 letters during his time on the Malvinas, and he's kept every single one of them. And he even carried all of them in his pockets in nylon bags during the war. But we'll get back to this in a second. So these headlines from Argentina were winning on the left and were still winning on the right, went down as some of the most emblematic phrases in the history of the war and of the dictatorship, and is actually a documentary by the same name. In fact, there will be a charity event in Argentina that was done to collect money for the soldiers. People would knit sweaters, they would donate their jewelry, thinking that this money would eventually get to the soldiers, but that money never got to the soldiers. So finally, on June 14th, 1982, British forces marched almost unstopped into Port Stanley, while the Argentines laid their weapons and surrendered after 74 days of the initial invasion. So remember the letters that I was just telling you about Marcelo? Listen to his story when he was being disarmed by the British forces.
Yo me arrastraba por el barro, por la piedra, pero siempre las guardaba en estos plásticos que encontraba. estaban impecables. Entonces el inglés en un momento palpa mi lateral de la pierna y saca una bolsa, ¿no? de uno de los dos bolsillos. Y me dice, ¿y esto qué es? Y digo, son cartas. Sí, ya sé que son cartas, me dice, pero me las tenés que dar. El resto me las dieron. Y a veces te la tenés que jugar. Entonces le dije, sí, mirá, yo ya sé que los demás te las dieron porque vengo viendo cargadores, bayonetas tiradas. Ya sé que te lo dieron, pero no me las saques. Me dice, pero los otros me lo dieron, me lo tenés que dar. Digo, ya me sacaste el fusil, el correaje, no tengo municiones, me sacaste todo. Ya prácticamente, le dije, me atreví, le digo, ya no tengo nada, no me dejaste nada. Dentro de poco no me voy a acordar cómo me llamo. Y en alguna de estas cartas está mi nombre. Me miró y me las guardó. No me las dio, me las guardó él.
So Marcelo still keeps the 187 letters that he received while at Malvinas, and out of those letters, 2 are from my parents. On June 14th, 1982, the dictator that was in power, Galtieri, he gave a 13-minute speech to the whole nation on the TV, admitting the surrendering of the Argentine nation, much to the dismay of the population that had been led to believe that their side was winning. Let's take a look at a part of this speech.
El combate de Puerto Argentino ha finalizado. Nuestros soldados lucharon con esfuerzo supremo por la dignidad de la nación. Los que cayeron están vivos para siempre en el corazón y la historia grande de los argentinos. No tenemos solo el bronce de las antiguas glorias, tenemos nuestros héroes, hombres de carne y hueso del presente, nombres que serán esculpidos por nosotros y las generaciones venideras. Enfrentaron con más coraje que armamento la abrumadora superioridad de una potencia apoyada por la tecnología militar de los Estados Unidos de Norteamérica, sorprendentemente enemigos de la Argentina y de su pueblo.
So the Argentine dictator was removed a few days later, and the dictatorship ended within a year, leaving a toll of around 30,000 dead as a result of 7 years of state terrorism. Upon returning, British crowds saluted their troops, and of course, British relationship with the islands increased and strengthened. Thatcher continued as prime minister for another 8 years, with her image vastly strengthened after the war. And we're going to see her now. Here she is on January 10th, 1983, during a surprise visit to the Falkland Islands. And because of that, every year, the Islanders observe Margaret Thatcher Day on January 10th. 649 Argentines and 255 British soldiers died, as well as 3 civilians, and between both parties, over 2,500 people were wounded. This is the Argentine cemetery at Darwin, about a 2-hour drive from Port Stanley. Well, what's concerning is not only the amount of people that died or were wounded during the war, but in Argentina, there's been more people, more soldiers that have died after the war because of PTSD, mostly because of suicides. So this is a UN resolution from 1982 on the left and 1984 on the right. So these are 2 UN resolutions basically saying that both parties should resume negotiations and find a diplomatic solution to the sovereignty of the islands. As a result of the war, like I was mentioning, relations between the islands and Great Britain strengthened, providing economic aid and more military presence more than ever. And nowadays, there's about 1,500 military personnel that are stationed at Falkland Islands, and also a military base was created at Mount Pleasant. This is the first landing of an airplane at Mount Pleasant Airport in 1985, which was actually a picture provided by a cruise ship guest a few years ago because he was sent to the Falkland Islands a few months after the 1982 war, and he was able to take this picture. So the clearing of the landmines was and has been a project for many, many years, many of which have been deactivated, the vast majority, but there has been a small part that have not. But honestly, there is not a lot of concern about this because they're either marked out of bounds or because penguins live there now, and penguins are not heavy enough to actually set them off. So there doesn't seem to be much of a reason to upset these natural environments, especially when, once again, they have been clearly marked out of bounds. So there was a team from Zimbabwe that was hired to dig out the mines and deactivate them, and apparently they've done a tremendous job, and many of which have actually stayed on the islands and now live, people from Zimbabwe now live on the islands. And a few years ago, I went on a tour, and the tour guide commented that these demining experts had assured that an area had been cleared, and to prove to the locals that this area had been cleared, they challenged a local kelper team to a football match in this part. So the match was played, and nobody got injured, so they seem to have done a proper job, and they removed all the mines. In 1990, the first post-war diplomatic agreement happens between Great Britain and Argentina, and then in 1991, the first visit of Argentines is allowed into the islands, especially the Argentine relatives. In 1994, the Constitution of Argentina is reformed, and they add a paragraph stating that the Argentine nation ratifies its illegitimate and imprescriptible sovereignty of the Malvinas, South Georgia, and South Sandwich Islands, and the maritime spaces corresponding for them being a part of the national territory. So the claim for Malvinas is actually in the Argentinian national constitution nowadays. For several years, the issue of Malvinas springs up every once in a while. Their relationships alternate between hot and cold, and every once in a while we hear that there's a bit of ruffling of feathers, either from the British side or most likely from the Argentinian side. A referendum was held in 2013 where islanders were asked the following question. The question was, do you wish the Falkland Islands to retain their current political status as an overseas territory of the United Kingdom? The results were an overwhelming yes. 99.8% of the population said yes, while the remaining 0.2% said no. 0.2% represents 3 people. And out of those 3 people, it is said that 1 did not really understand the question. Had the majority said no, that they didn't want to be part of Great Britain, then there would have been a second referendum with possible options. After the war, Argentina has insisted diplomatically on many occasions that talks be resumed, that perhaps the transfer of the islands back to Argentina could be a possibility, but the British government has been very adamant in their position to retain the islands and not open a lot of diplomatic talks. The United Nations has repeatedly demanded both countries to resume talks to reach a solution to the dispute, and these are resolutions from 2015, 2016, 2017, and we pretty much see one of these every year, basically one UN resolution saying, let's open up discussions. There's a bit of ruffles from both sides. Argentina says something, Britain says something, and then it doesn't go much further than that. So every year on April 2nd, which is the day that the war started, it is a national holiday that is celebrated in Argentina in honor of those who fought in 1982. And you will see in this day, on April 2nd, that many institutions, social organizations, political parties, etc., they all express maybe their discontent for the situation, or their support for the people who fought during Malvinas, or just they use this day as a way to remember the people who fought and died during the war. So this is a team that I support back home, Racing, my football team. And obviously on April 2nd of 2018, in this case, they went out to play with this map and this title on their jerseys. And this is just one example of many. On the islands, every June 14th is Liberation Day, which is the day that the war ended.
Muchos me dicen, pero vos mataste a alguien, vos tiraste con tu fusil. Mirá cómo será de bruto que yo era, o de nuevo, de novato, Nunca supe si mi fusil funcionaba, nunca tiré. Entonces muchos se enojan. ¿Cómo que nunca tiró? No tiré. Por suerte. ¿Cómo hubiera vivido yo si hubiera matado a alguien?
So this is street art from the city of Buenos Aires, and you probably will see many, many more examples when you go to Buenos Aires. This is just one of many, another example right here. And you will also see this phrase in many places. Las Malvinas son argentinas. The Malvinas are Argentinian. Again, not my personal opinion, just repeating what it says here. And this is a phrase that is used all over Argentina. Or another one is Las Malvinas fueron, son y serán argentinas. The Malvinas have been, are, and will be part of Argentina. So all the governments since 1982, the Argentinian government since 1982, their official stance has been that the Malvinas should be part of Argentina, although that doesn't necessarily mean that they have done something about it. And more examples here. This is actually from the Tierra del Fuego National Park. So if maybe some of you went there yesterday, then you might have seen this sign in the national park in Ushuaia. This is a bill that was released in 2013 that has the Malvinas right there. I actually have it right here. As you can see, has the Malvinas map on it. I'll sell it for $50. That's 50 right there. So, but as a fun fact, or not so fun fact, when it was released in 2013, it was worth $4, and now it is worth 4 US cents. So 1% of its value in only 11 years difference. All right, so I want to take a moment to reflect on some things and give you a little bit of my view of the situation. So I think that in Argentina, a lot of people do what I call speaking from the couch, because it's very easy to be on your couch, to be at home and look at a politician saying, yeah, the Malvinas should be part of Argentina, but I think that the vast majority of these people don't really know what that means. They don't know what that entails. It's not only lowering a flag and raising another one. It's much, much more than that. Nobody that I know, except people that I've taken with me to cruise with me and have seen the Falklands, I don't know anybody else that has been to the Falkland Islands. So the vast majority of people in Argentina don't really know what life is like in the Falkland Islands. They don't know that they are pretty much British, that they have red telephone booths, that they speak on the other side, that they drive on the other side, that they speak like British. They don't know all that. It's just a message that has been told to them many, many times, and they repeat it without really understanding what that means. So would these people that are saying the Malvinas should be part of Argentina, would these people be willing to move to the Falkland Islands if tomorrow they're part of Argentina? Imagine like the UK does nowadays, which they add a lot of economic aid, especially they pay for tuitions and flights for people who want to go study in the UK. Part of their spend of their defense budget goes to the Falkland Islands. Imagine if tomorrow the Falkland Islands are part of Argentina and the government says, okay, well, now it's part of Argentina, so we are going to need 10% of your salary to support those people over there, which is what you want, right? I mean, you said you wanted them, so 10% of the salary. I think a lot of people would probably not support that idea so much as they do now. So that's one thing. Also, what is very interesting to note is something that I've been saying for a few years, and actually now is the main message, the main slogan for the Malvinas cause, which is that, in my opinion, the Malvinas cause as a way to create national unification is better if they're not part of Argentina. Because if they're part of Argentina, then you will have people who say, let's give them back, let's create an independent country, they should be part of South Africa, we should give them money, we shouldn't give them money, etc., etc. If they're a part of Britain, then you can have somebody else to blame for your problems. You know, it's them, it's their problem. So it's something that unifies Argentina. And nowadays, or most Argentinians, in Argentina, basically you would have two types of people. The people who don't really care that much about it, who are not going to be so vocal about the situation. If they don't care about it, they're just going to say, okay, if that's what you think, that's what you think, okay. And then you're going to have the people who really support this cause, and they will be more vocal about it, obviously. But again, if they are part of Argentina, then you will have many different sectors of society saying we should do A, we should do B, we should do C. So as a way to create national unity, it is very better, in my opinion, that they're part of another country. And fun fact is that now the new slogan for Malvinas, about a year and a half ago, is Malvinas nos une, Malvinas unites us, which is exactly what I've been saying for many, many years, because that's how it is. If this belongs to another country, then Malvinas does unite the people of Argentina. If they're part of Argentina, then you can't blame your problems to somebody else. And a question that I would pose to you, I'm not going to answer that, I'm just going to pose it to you and you can think about it, is we talked the other day in the talk about Patagonia about how Argentina conquered the south of Argentina, what is now Argentina, but used to be part of the natives. And lots of tribes were living there, and then eventually the central government of Buenos Aires expelled them or killed the natives. So my question would be, why in the 1800s did Argentina, or the concept of Argentina, win that war, and why in 1982 the concept of Argentina lost that war? That's a question for you to think about. So however both countries feel about the islands, life goes on here as normal, especially for the millions of animals besides humans that inhabit this island. In the end, it is a unique piece of land that holds an incredible variety of wildlife, and in that place, it belongs to anybody that wants to enjoy it, no matter which colors your flag has. So I hope that you have enjoyed this talk. I hope that you've learned some things, that this will make you appreciate the islands a little bit more. And I'm going to close with Alisa's last thoughts on the matter.
It's my home. Quite simple, I think. It's where you grow up. I think home is always where the heart is, pretty much. Even if you move to another country, people's hearts are still in their homelands, I think. And this is where we grew up. This is our home. We hope it'll remain that way.
Thank you.